It is? We're good? Excellent. Those of you who have seen some of my other talks are probably... They can't hear... now they can hear me. You never close your eyes. No, so those of you who usually hear me speak might be used to more humorous sessions. This one is dry. This is everything I know about certificate services. And there isn't much you can do in terms of jokes with certificate services. Believe me, I have tried. Like, how many certificate services administrators does it take to change a light bulb? Well, you don't change the light bulb, you revoke the light bulb and issue a new one. Okay, and you know, that level of humour is exactly what my son says, you are really bad at jokes. Because it doesn't matter how funny you are, your kid thinks that you can't tell jokes. Anyway, in this session, I'm going to talk about what a certificate is, what a certificate authority is, what a CRL and a CDP is, what an offline route CA is and how you configure one, certificate templates, auto-enrolment, online certificate status protocol arrays, CA security and key archiving and recovery. It's a massive amount of material to get through and I will be moving through it fairly quickly. But the idea of the session is that while people tend to be generally familiar with things like DHCP and DNS, certificate services is one of those more and more integral parts of our infrastructure that a lot of people simply don't have any idea about. One of the big problems that a lot of organisations have is that they have had someone who's gone and deployed a CA and then they've kind of forgotten about it. And then all at once, every certificate in the organisation expires, and the reason it expires is no one's remembered to renew the CA certificate. So those are the sorts of things that I'm going to be talking about, but you know, not with so many jokes as usual. Tomorrow, this theatre, I'll be on the jokes when I'm talking about stupid things that cloud and system administrators do. Anyway, so certificates, right off the bat. What on earth is a certificate? Well, it's a specially digitally signed file. So it's just a bit of data. But it's a way of proving identity. And you can use it in a lot of different ways to prove identity. You can sign things. You can use it to encrypt things. But what it is a file. It's a special kind of file and it's got a whole lot of special kind of properties, but that's all it is, it's a file. When you look at a certificate in Windows, you can pull up the certificate's information, so you can look at the properties of the certificate. And this can tell you a whole lot of interesting bits and pieces about the certificate. For example, you can see on this one that we have who issued the certificate. SID DC tailspintoys.internal. Issued by this, valid from 2014 to 2015, and that you have a private key that corresponds to this certificate. So this tells us that we've got the certificate with a private key. We can see information about the certificate server. Tailspin Toys SID DCCA. We can see the public key, the visible key, the key that's visible to the whole world. We can see the signature algorithm that was used. In this case, it's SHA-1 RSA. Now, in general, a very good rule of thumb is that the stronger the algorithm is and the longer the key is, the more trustworthy the certificate is. Because the idea with a certificate, as I said, it's a special kind of file. And the idea is that you've got a public key that everybody can see, and that you've got a private key that corresponds to that public key mathematically. And the stronger the algorithm and the longer the key, the less likely it is that someone can generate the same private key for that public key. And it's the person who's got the private key is basically proving that they're related to that public key. So if you've got a short key and you've got a rubbish algorithm, someone can basically run a mathematical attack against your certificate and figure out what the private key is. So sometimes you'll hear about SSL, or what should be properly called a TLS certificate, because SSL has actually been deprecated, but it's sort of like we use fax machine and we use ATM machine, and we've got a whole lot of redundancy, weird redundancy in English, and I can guarantee that in 100 years they'll still call it an SSL certificate, even though it'll be something else entirely by then, because SSL, again, had problems with its algorithm. So they revised it. They came up with transport layer security, and it's technically a TLS certificate, but we all call it SSL certificates because everybody knows what that means. So, extensions explain what the certificate is authorised to be used for. So in this case, we're looking at a certificate that's configured for client authentication. With that is a thing called an OID. An OID is a special identifier that describes the purpose of the certificate, that's intercepted by whoever's consuming the certificate, and they look at it and they go, oh, okay, that OID means that this certificate is used for this purpose. You see, the problem with sitting in the front row is you can't run out when you... You can heckle. Okay, so the other thing that's very important with a certificate, and this is one of the things that I find really interesting, because when I talk to systems administrators, they often don't know how this works. This is where we get into the Hogwarts of certificate services, because they understand what a certificate is, but they don't understand what a certificate revocation list is, or a certificate revocation list distribution point. So what happens is every time a certificate is encountered for the first time by a client, what it does is it should go out and check whether or not that certificate has been revoked. So the certificate revocation list is a list of all certificates that come from a particular server that have been revoked. And that certificate revocation list is published to a certificate revocation list distribution point, or a CDP. So let's get further into the basics. What is a certificate authority or a certification authority? In Windows, it's a role surface. It's something that you can install on a Windows server. It's been there at least since Windows 2000. I'm not sure if NT4 supported it, but I certainly became aware of it in Windows 2000. What it does is it issues and manages certificates. You issue a request to the CA, and that request can be handled manually or automatically. And there's a lot of automatic stuff that goes on with certificate services, especially in Active Directory environments, where the client has a lot of information about you and about the computer, and it can go and talk automatically to a CA that's integrated with AD, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Or it can be manual. And if you've ever filled out one of those forms where you go and put in your organisational information, or you paste a request file in, that's the manual process. The CA administrator then approves or declines the certificate request. So if they decline it, you don't get your certificate. If they approve it, they do. And you can set up automatic approval rules in some cases for certain types of certificates. Approval, as I said, can be automated. The CA then issues the certificate. Depending on how you've got things set up, that means that the certificate can automatically be installed on your machine, or you simply might come along and download the certificate and then install it on the machine. So, how much you trust a CA depends on the criteria for validating the identity of the certificate requester. If you've just got an internal CA that's being used internally, you're not really going to be spending a whole lot of time checking that the person that's requested the certificate is the person that requested the certificate. However, if you're trying to run a CA as a business, in theory, if someone's coming to pay you a certain amount of money for an identity certificate, one of those really top-level, high-class, first-order certificates, then some sort of investigation should take place. It might be that you have to provide a company number. It might be that you have to provide further details. It might be that they have to come out and take a photo of you or something like that. It depends on the certificate. But the idea is that organisations should not, and this is really important, should not just issue certificates to someone saying, yes, I'm Taylor Swift. No, I'm not. But there's a guy on Twitter without some sort of verification. And there has been cases where certain CAs haven't necessarily been as rigorous as they should be about checking the identification of the person that they're issuing a certificate to. So big trusted third-party CAs, in theory, and mostly in practicality, have a rigorous process to validate the identity of a certificate requester. Now, there's another part of certificates. A certificate can be revoked. It's like your passport being revoked. You can say this certificate is no longer valid. Certificate validity should be checked each time the certificate is first encountered. So the certificate server, as I said, may host or points to the certificate revocation list. And that information is sitting inside the certificate. So when you issue the certificate actually has the information inside it. This is where you go to check if I'm still valid. So there's a whole lot of stories around when this has been implemented where revocation checks might have been turned off. And one of the things that Troy Hunt, who's a security researcher in Australia who runs HaveIBeenPwned.com and has a jet ski, that's another $1 for you, Troy. What happened is that app developers have gone and turned off CRL checks on their apps. In fact, there was a banking app by one of Australia's biggest banks, and don't ask which bank, who had said that they had a valid certificate, but they wouldn't perform a revocation check. So they would just basically accept that an SSL connection or a TLS connection was valid, but they would never check whether or not the certificate was right. It didn't even check if the certificate was there. It just assumed. So this should always happen. It should always happen that a check is performed. And if the certificate's not valid, well, the connection should not be accepted. But we've all seen it where we've been browsing the web and we've hit a website where they haven't renewed their certificate. And our web browser says, well, do you want to keep going? And interestingly enough, 60% of people that aren't IT people don't. 90% of IT people keep going through going, yeah. So the Heartbleed bug was one that involved SSL. And what happened is that if you were found that you were susceptible to this, one of the things that you should have done is have your current certificate revoked and be issued a new certificate, simply because it was technically possible under the Heartbleed bug to go and extract the private key and get a copy of that certificate. So your certificate could be compromised and in theory your traffic could be intercepted. So the idea was, one of the things that you should have done is revoked and reissued your certificate. I haven't done the research, but I am fairly sure that the vast majority of organisations didn't actually do that. They simply patched it and hoped that no one had compromised their security. And that's one of the problems that we get with security, right? Is that we patch it and we hope that we haven't been compromised. If we're taking ourselves seriously, we need to take ourselves seriously and we need to do things when we've been compromised, like revoke our certificates and get a new one. If you suspect someone has access to the private key, revoke your certificate. Don't just sort of sit there and hope, especially if you are running a bank or if you're running anything that's important, like that great big secret New Zealand defence establishment that every Australian suspects exists because no country would get rid of their Air Force. So the CRL is a list of revoked certificates published. The CRL is regularly published by the CA. The client checks this list when they encounter a new certificate, and when they do this, they need to be able to find the certificate revocation list. So this is a mistake people do when they're setting up their own CAs internally, is that they go and put a CA and they don't look at where the CRL distribution points are, because they're usually just sitting on the certificate server. So if you're trying to consume a certificate from outside the firewall, of course you can't hit the CRL distribution point and the whole thing doesn't work and you go, well, I don't know what's going on. Because you have to understand, that's part of it. You get the certificate, but you always have to check where the certificate revocation list is, and there needs to be a check to perform that the certificate is not on that list. If that check's performed, the certificate will be accepted, as long as it's not on that list. So that means that you need to think, if you're running your own CA, I need to make the certificate revocation list accessible to the people that are consuming this certificate. If the CRL isn't accessible, the certificate should be considered invalid. Now, as I said, some applications, some clients will just go, oh, I couldn't find the CRL. This is probably okay. And understand that there's app developers that are quite happy with that approach to security. That if they can't get to the CRL DP, they're going to say everything's cool. And you're not going to know whether or not an app that's on your device follows the rules or it doesn't follow the rules. Now, there's a trust chain with certificate services. What you have is you have a bottom level CA that provides information about itself and the CA that issued its signing certificate. So what you have is you have a root certification authority and you have subordinate certification authorities. To use a certificate, you must trust either the issuing CA or a CA above the issuing CA. So the way that it works is, for example, VeriSign has a really super high top-level CA, but the certificate servers that issue the certificates that you actually use are probably down level from that. So you trust the high level CA, but what happens is you consume certificates from the lower level CAs. Now, Windows clients, if you've ever gone and looked into your certificates or Internet Explorer properties, trust a whole bunch of CAs. And with software updates, that list changes because sometimes Microsoft finds out that a CA has been compromised. And what it'll do is it'll go out and it'll revoke or say, don't go and trust certificates issued. There was a couple of years ago, there was a CA somewhere in Malaysia that got compromised, and it was issuing certificates that made it look like they were from Adobe. And so you got this certificate, it looked legitimate, your client trusted it, it looked like it was something was signed by Adobe, and we all know what a festering pile of Australian propaganda Flash is. Well, you can imagine the kind of malware that could have been distributed in that case. See, I'm still trying to tell jokes even though they don't work. I don't know. If a client trusts a CA at the top, you'll trust the CAs further down the chain. But signing certificates can be revoked. So what can happen is that this top-level CA over here, which issues the signing certificate to the bottom-level CA, can say, I revoke that certificate. And the moment it does that, all of the certificates issued by that CA, by clients that trust that CA, are going to be deemed invalid. And the idea is, if a CA becomes compromised, you can basically say, right, we don't know what's been tampered with, so we're not going to trust anything there. We're going to revoke that entirely, and we're going to have to reissue the certificates because we don't know what's been broken, we don't know what's legitimate, we don't know what's been issued in error and what's been issued correctly. So there's 4 types of certificate server available in Windows Server. The root CA, so there's 4 types of general, sorry. Root CA, subordinate CA, the enterprise CA, and a standalone CA. And this is important because 2 of these types integrate with Active Directory and 2 of them are standalone. And you can use a combination of them as long as you understand when you've got a root standalone and when you've got a root enterprise. So a root CA is your ultimate trust point. And by ultimate trust point, I mean it signs its own certificate. So it's sort of like the passport office, right? We trust the passport office because the passport office issues us passports. So we trust the passports because we trust the passport office. But our faith in the passport office is sort of a bit more ephemeral. It's a bit harder to, we just have to trust that. And that's what a root CA is. Like, we assume that we're going to assume that we trust this root CA. You trust a CA, and then you trust all certificates issued by the root and all certificates issued by CAs that have their signing certificates issued by the root. You trust all certificates then issued by CAs whose signing certificates were issued by CAs whose signing certificates were issued by CAs whose signing all the way to the bottom of the turtles, because it's turtles all the way down. So your CA trust chains. Here we've got CA at the top, CA, 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 CA. Root CA signs its own certificates, trusts the certificates issued by a root CA or its subordinate, add the root CA certificates to a trusted certificate store. So what you do, if you've got a new root CA, you can go in and add them here to your trusted root certificate authorities. So this is where, if you're using your own standalone CA and it's not getting published to Active Directory, where you can go and put a CA certificate, and then your computer will go and trust all of the certificates issued by that CA, or one under that. You've also got the trusted root certification policy. So let's say you want every computer in your organisation to automatically trust a specific CA. You can import that CA certificate into that policy, and then group policy goes out and it gets all of your computers to go and trust it. And that's one of the cool things about Active Directory, is that Active Directory gives you a way to quickly spread that trust out across your organisation of a particular CA. So your root CA usually only issues certificates to a subordinate. Now, in terms of the advice I'm giving here, this is the theory. Now, if you've got a really, really small organisation, often what you do is you put in an enterprise root CA and you don't worry about it. If you've got a slightly larger organisation, you take a bit more of an appropriate or a pragmatic design approach. And what you do is you have a root CA, and that only issues certificates to the signing CAs, and then the subordinate CAs, and the subordinate CAs go and distribute certificates to everybody. Because the advantage of that model is that the root CA, and we'll talk about offline root CAs in a moment, can revoke the certificate of basically the issuing CA should the issuing CA become compromised. So if you were in my earlier session today, I was talking about assume breach, and one of the things that you need to assume is that someone is going to try and compromise your CA. So if they compromise it, what do? Well, you revoke its certificate and then you create a new CA and you issue a signing certificate to that. But you keep your root CA in a position, and this is why we go to an offline root CA, which I'll talk about in a moment, where it won't get compromised. And of course, offline root CA, it's sort of in the name as to why it won't be compromised, because it's sitting in a safe under a box in a concrete slab that you can only get to on the 3rd of March every leap year. In small environments, the root CA may be the only CA. So someone's put in an enterprise root CA because, you know, if you've only got 5 servers and someone compromises your CA, they've probably already compromised your domain controller, and let's face it, if you're that far up the creek, you might as well just tip everything out and start again. Your CA trust chains, root CA, as I said, can go and revoke those CAs below it. A compromised root CA is the loss of ultimate point of trust. You need to revoke every certificate. It's all gone. Everything's on fire. There's screaming, there's wailing, there's gnashing of teeth. It's like the Kardashians have come to rule over us all. Including signing certificates of subordinate CAs. You will need to deploy a new CA. You will need to deploy an entire new CA infrastructure. Your subordinate CAs. A subordinate CA should be or can be an issuing CA. Its day-to-day task is to issue certificates, to revoke certificates, to publish CRL distribution points. That's what your clients are interacting with on a day-to-day basis. It receives the certificate requests, it issues the certificates, it revokes the certificates, it publishes certificate revocation lists. Okay, so in your hierarchy, you have your root CA, your intermediate CA, and your issuing CAs. Now, in some organisations, these are what are called policy CAs. Now, what policy CAs do, and as I have said in other sessions, and as I will continue to say, one of the big things that's going to change about the profession of IT professional is the impact and the required understanding of compliance. Because government are going to be putting in more and more regulation, and it's going to be your job as an IT professional to determine whether or not that regulation is being followed and being technically implemented properly. So with a policy CA, what you can do is you can implement a policy about how your organisation uses certificates. It might be that you say that we're only going, this is how we're going to validate things, this is how we're going to revoke things, these are our policies and procedures. We've gone away from the old cowboy days where it's just like, I'm going to revoke it, because it's Tuesday. Okay, there's going to be a reason, there's going to be documentation, the evil enemy of the systems administrator, documentation. Okay, the thing we all fear is going to creep up on us in the middle of the night is the need to document things. Well, get used to it, we've got to do it. Your policy CA allows you to spell out certificate issuance policies, requires policy documents, involves settings, enforcing some of these policies where that's possible. Who can approve certificate requests? And you need to think about that. Who in your organisation can approve a certificate request? If you're going to go out and issue a certificate for identity or an SSL certificate, not that you're probably worried about that, who has the authority to do that? What's the maximum validity for a certificate? Do you say 5 years? Do you say 1 year? What are you thinking? Why are you thinking that? What is your revocation procedure? What has to happen before you revoke a certificate? For example, you can have a certificate associated with a person's computer, an IPsec certificate. And when the person comes onto your network, that IPsec certificate allows that computer to communicate with everything else on your network because you've set your network up so it's got all IPsec on it. And your DCs, your file servers, nothing will talk to a computer unless it's got this IPsec certificate to authenticate itself. Okay, someone loses their computer. Or they come into the office one day and they say, oh, couldn't find my laptop this morning. Do you revoke the certificate then? Or do you wait until they're absolutely sure? Or let's say they leave it on the bus. Now, when you leave something on the bus, sometimes you get it back. Sometimes you don't. So you need to think about these things. What happens with a person's smart card? Someone loses their smart card, and that smart card allows them to swipe into the building 24 hours a day. When do you revoke that smart card? Do you do it immediately? Do you give them time to find it? You need to think about these things. You need to write them down so it doesn't appear that you're just handing this down sort of out of whatever's taking you at the time. An enterprise CA is fully integrated into Active Directory. You can use Active Directory to obtain information required for certificate requests and enrolment. So normally when you are filling out a certificate request, and I'll show you this a little later, you provide all of this information, who I am, where I am, what I'm doing, what my address is, blah, 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 blah. All of this information is stored in Active Directory. So an Active Directory certificate authority is able to pull that information out of Active Directory and push it into the certificate because the certificate will use that information. It allows the automation of certificate management, and that is the absolute genius of Active Directory certificate services, is that it is fully integrated into Active Directory. It allows you to automatically issue certificates for a whole variety of things to a whole variety of people because you trust your Active Directory infrastructure. You install it only on a domain member. Why? Because it's got to be able to query Active Directory. And certificates are automatically trusted by computers that are members of the domain or members of the same forest. I usually sit at home and write all the time, so I don't necessarily talk this fast for this long. Occasionally I need a drink. Now, Enterprise CA is not as useful for people or computers that are not members of the domain. Why? Because they don't have all of that information. You can have with an Enterprise CA, you can have a standalone CA or an Enterprise CA as a parent. So the root can be a standalone or the root can be an Enterprise CA. And if you've ever done a Microsoft official curriculum course, generally what you have is you've got an Enterprise root and then an Enterprise subordinate. Why? Because when you're designing a lab and you're shipping it out to many, many people around the world, what you don't want to do is have to sort of configure an offline root CA and then try to get them to use that in the lab. There's some exercises that do that, but generally you've got an Enterprise CA there just because it makes things a whole lot easier. Another cool thing about Enterprise CAs is that they can use certificate templates that are stored within Active Directory. Talk about certificate templates a bit more in a minute. But basically, they define the purpose and functionality of the certificate. They're stored in AD. They're available to all Enterprise CAs in the forest. Now, you can also configure auto-enrolment and renewal. So that means that if you issue a certificate to someone or to a computer, it can be automatically enrolled, and then when it expires, it automatically renews. And the benefit of doing that is it means that the person who is using it never has to think about the certificate. That underlying certificate, that underlying security infrastructure is sitting there, and it's working and it's renewing automatically, and the user is unaware. Because that's one of the other things about ADCS, is that basically, if you do need to interact with it, it hasn't changed that much since Windows 2000. It is not a user-friendly product. And trying to get the idea, I mean, if you've ever gone through manual certificate enrolment, you know that Barry, from accounts, there's no way that Barry's going to be able to figure out how to enrol himself in a personal certificate. So what you have to do with Barry for accounts, because Barry may look really good, he may be excellent at accounting, but, you know, it's surprising that the guy can tie his tie. Okay? He certainly wouldn't be able to enrol in a certificate. So you automate the process of deploying and renewing certificates. Now with a standalone CA, well, it's not integrated into Active Directory. Now with a standalone CA, you can install it on a computer that's a domain member, or you can install it on a computer that's a standalone computer. You also use a standalone CA for an offline root CA, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. You can deploy a standalone root CA on the perimeter network. You could, if you wanted to, go and deploy one as an IaaS VM in Azure, but the entire process of managing certificates is manual. So you don't get all of that nice automatic foo-foo that you get with a enterprise CA. And it does not support the certificate templates that are stored in Active Directory. And this is one of the big ones that I see with people. They go, wait a sec, there was a beautiful EFS encryption certificate template that's in Active Directory. I've installed this standalone CA, why can't I issue from that? And it's like, because it doesn't support it. What you've got to do is you've got to go through and do it the really old manual way. And it's a lot harder to do that. And they're like, well, then I just want to use enterprise CAs all the time. And I thought, well, you don't always want to do it that way either. It does support advanced certificate requests and the certificate request generators that you can go through and generate a certificate request. It's got all of the bells and the foo-foos and the OIDs and the bits and pieces that you need to submit a request to a CA. So, your CRL distribution point must be accessible for a certificate to be valid. The client checks the CDP for the CRL. Now your CDP can be a file share or it can be a website. So file share obviously makes sense for your internal network, but doesn't make as much sense today as it might have made 15 years ago. It makes much more sense for this to come through a website where a web request is made and a check is performed. It can also, the CRL can be also published to Active Directory. And this is what happens with enterprise CAs, is that the CRL is published on a regular basis to Active Directory. So Active Directory clients go and check Active Directory first to see whether or not a CRL has been published there. You can also use what's called an online certificate status protocol array, and I'll talk about those in a couple of minutes. So, certificates have a natural lifespan determined by the issuing CA. You can't have a certificate that has an expiration date that is beyond that of the expiration date of the signing certificate of the CA that issued the certificate. This is one of the things that people really forget, and this is where organisations that had someone install certificate services for some point get themselves in trouble. They install certificate services, they've got a default of 5 years. And 5 years later, everything stops working. And they're going, what's happened? Not only has the CA certificate expired, because they didn't bother renewing it, all of the other certificates actually had that as a hard date. Because one of the things that people never check when they issue a certificate is, when does this certificate expire? Or they look at it and go, oh, it's a couple of years from now. As long as it's not tomorrow, I'm cool. Revoking a certificate makes the certificate no longer valid. A check is performed, as I said, each time a new certificate is encountered. Now, there's a caveat with this check. The certificates and the certificate includes information about how often a certificate revocation list is published. So the client doesn't check every time it uses a certificate. What it does is it says, oh, okay, I know that a new CRL is going to be published in 7 days, so I'm going to accept this certificate for the next 7 days. So it's possible to revoke a certificate and still have clients use that certificate for a certain amount of time. And you adjust your publication schedule depending on the type of certificate and the sensitivity of the certificate that you're issuing. Certificate properties include the address of the certificate revocation list. I showed you that at the start. And there's a bit of repetition I've put in these slides simply because I'm moving through material so quickly that sometimes I need to come back and make sure that you've got that in your head before I move to the next part. So, revoking certificates. When you revoke a certificate, you need to specify a reason. So you can actually specify unspecified as a region, should you so choose. And that just means I've revoked it. You select the certificate authority console, you revoke the certificate. Your reasons are that the key has been compromised. So if you are in a more official capacity and you actually have to have a log of why you've revoked a certificate, you can go with key compromise. You can go with CA compromise. You've found malware on your CA. That's probably not going to be very good, is it? Affiliation change. A person has changed their affiliation. You basically interpret that as to what you want. I've always seen it as being they've moved out of the organisation and so it's no longer relevant. The certificate has been superseded. So one of the things you can do with certificate templates is you can come out with new versions of the certificate template. So you might have issued a new certificate and then you revoke the previous one so then only the new one's being used, and it might have a better key length or it might have a better algorithm. Cessation of operations, you're simply not using it anymore. Certificate hold. Now certificate hold is a special one, and it's a special one because it's the only revocation reason that you can use where you can go back and change your mind. So remember I was telling you about the smart card. If someone's lost their smart card and that smart card allows them to come into and out of the door. Well, if you put that on certificate hold, they can't use that smart card, but you can take it off certificate hold and it becomes valid again. But that's the only reason out of the ones listed that will not absolutely kill the certificate. So you can go back with the certificate hold. And then you've got unspecified, which means I'm not going to tell you. Revocation list. Have a list of certificate serial numbers and the revocation reasons. A CRL contains a list of all. So the big CRL contains a list of all revoked certificates. And by default with Windows Server Certificate Services, it's published once a week. The Delta CRL contains only those certificates that have been revoked since the publication of the full CRL. Because this is, again, gives you an idea of the creaky age of certificate services. The way it worked was your client would go and pull the whole CRL down and then pull the Delta CRL down. And if that certificate server's been in operation for a while, needless to say, that CRL can get fairly long. So if you're thinking about a client pulling down a couple of megabytes of revocation list, that's probably not entirely the most optimal way to do things, is it? So it might pull that down once a week and then pull down a much smaller file every day. And the CRL is published by default once a day. You can alter that in the properties. So when a certificate is encountered by a client, it retrieves the CRL and the Delta CRL. It checks to see if the serial number is present there. If it's not, it basically accepts it. And then it'll cache the CRL for the publication interval, which is by default 1 week. It caches the Delta CRL for the publication interval, which is by default 1 day. So every time it goes and uses a certificate, it'll use either the cached CRL or it'll go pull a new version of it. So the way I described it a bit earlier was kind of inaccurate, but that's what I meant about when you're revoking a certificate. If your cached CRL is still sitting there and your Delta CRL is still sitting there, the certificate will still be accepted even though it's been revoked. You can edit the publication schedule on the CA. This is the defaults, 1 week for CRL publication interview, 1 day. And you don't have to publish a Delta CRL. Work out what works for your organisation. If you're not revoking certificates all that often, probably doesn't matter. You can also manually publish a CRL, but just remember that anybody who has cached a copy of the existing CRL won't be looking for it until that has expired. Your distribution points can be hosted on local storage, websites, Active Directory, but needs to be accessible. Your CDB locations, you configure these on the Extensions tab of the CA properties. So you can see here that there's a whole lot of things. Now, one of the other big mistakes that people make with certificate services is that they might go and change this and then retire a certificate revocation list distribution point. Now, the problem with that is every previously issued certificate has the old list of CRL distribution points. Only newly issued certificates are going to have the updated information. So when you're thinking about your certificate lifespan and you're thinking, oh gosh, I might want to go and move my CDP, what you've got to realise is that you've got to keep your previous CDPs there, or at least one of them there, until such time as every previous certificate that has the old information is no longer in use. Because if you don't do that and you just get rid of them, in theory, if they can't find the CDP, they don't accept the certificate. And you might be, well, no, you should accept the certificate. I just moved it. I didn't want to revoke all my certificates. Clients that consume certificates need to perform CRL checks, assume it's invalid. Consumers need read access. Now, your offline root CA, the whole idea of an offline root CA is that you've got a CA that you only bring online when it needs to either revoke a certificate for a subordinate CA or issue a new certificate for a subordinate CA. Okay, because the idea is, of course, If it's offline, it's going to be really, 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 really hard for those nefarious hackers to compromise. Because if you've got it unplugged and it's sitting in a box and it's not doing anything, really hard to compromise. Or you might have a virtual machine that you completely export, although that's probably not as secure as having it as a completely separate box that's sitting in a safe, that's sitting in another safe, and it's got a leopard sitting on it. So your requirements is that you need to have it on a standalone, which means a non-domain joined server. You install a standalone root CA. You can put it on a secure isolated network, but offline should mean offline. Okay? That means that you need to come up with a way of patching that server in a secure manner. It means that you basically get offline updates from Windows Update Catalog, and then you bring the server up, you patch the server, you shut it down, sort of thing. You need to have a whole process involved in doing this. Avoid a VM in a production environment, even with shielded VMs, okay? If it's online, it's far more likely to be hacked than if it's offline, okay? There's all of these sort of people, like one sitting in the front row, who might be able to get into your stuff no matter how well you think you've protected your stuff, okay? It's like just evil ninjas, okay? Watch out for them. Your functionalities. All you need to issue subordinate CA signing certificates and revoke signing certificates and to publish CRL. So this is the other thing. You change your CRL publication interval, but again, you need to have that ability to revoke should you have a subordinate CA compromised. So you think of what's a reasonable thing. It might be once a month, but be aware that then if on the first day after you've published a CRL, you're going to have some clients out there who accept it. Now, the other thing that you need to do with a root CA, and this is probably the most challenging part of setting one up, is you've got to go and reconfigure it from the start so that the CRL, the CDPs are hosted in locations that are accessible even though the computer itself is offline. So what you do is you publish a CDP and you say, right, it's actually over here, and then you take the CRL and you go and put it over there, and then you can shut down the offline root CA. So that's the trick, and that's something that people forget, because what they do is they go and say, I'm going to have an offline root CA, and then they don't go and change all of that certificate information so that none of it's pointing at the local server. It's all pointing at a host that's actually online. So deploying it is just basically a matter of going through the wizard and making sure you set an appropriate validity period. You're just going to go with the standards for the most part, but the main one is that you're going to go, it's going to be a root CA, and it's going to be a standalone CA. Then what you do is you go in once you've deployed the CA and you set the request handling to set the certificate request status to pending. The administrator must explicitly issue the certificate. So that is so that this will only issue certificates if this is explicitly done. It won't automatically issue certificates. You then go and change the, as I said, the location of your CRL distribution point. And you do that here on this extensions, and you see it says extensions and CRL distribution point, and then you can see I've got a location there. So you specify the name, and the name will, in this case, be HTTP, SID, CRL, CDP, server DNS name, CA name. And that's just the automatic sort of foo-foo that's done when it comes to naming a certificate revocation list. So you then also need to modify the authority information access to also update that. So extensions and AIA. You then restart ADCS, and then you configure the offline root CA to support certificate revocation within Active Directory. So what you can do is you can take this information and you can run certutil, and you can configure Active Directory certificate services to support that. So what that will do is it'll mean that your Active Directory clients will trust the signing certificate from the offline root CA. Examples for pluralsight.com would be certutil -setreg CA dsconfig, configuration DC is pluralsight, DC is internal. And then you go and say, put that command in with certutil, and that will configure that particular pluralsight domain to support the offline root CA. You then publish a new CRL from the offline CA. You export that to your CDP. So the CRL by default will be located in system root, system32, certserv, certenroll. You move it to removable storage. You copy the CA certificate to removable storage as well. You copy the CRL from removable storage to each certificate revocation list distribution point, and then you're done. So you then deploy the CA cert and CRL to Active Directory. Again, using cert util, you can go and automatically import that in. Okay, then you go and deploy an enterprise subordinate CA, and you go through the process of doing that. You then perform a certificate request. So here, when you get to certificate request, the certificate request part of the wizard, what you do is you say, I want to make this certificate request, I'm going to make an offline request. Then you spin up your offline root CA, you handle the request, you issue the certificate, you come back to this wizard, and then you can set up, well, actually not back to the wizard, you come back to the certificate services console, you install the issued certificate, signing certificate for the CA, and then your subordinate CA will work. Now, all of these slides are going to be available, all whatever 100 and something slides, so you will be able to go through this yourself. Now, templates. Templates are stored in Active Directory. Now, the cool thing about a template is it allows you to modify the properties of how a certificate works. So each certificate has different properties. Its purpose, its minimum key length, its algorithm, its private key restrictions. A template is a collection of certificate properties. Enterprise CAs issue certificates based on templates that are stored within Active Directory. Now, what that means is by default, you can see here, these are the certificate templates that Active Directory will issue from by default. Now, there's actually about 5 times as many certificate templates stored in Active Directory than are issued by default by an ADCS server. And this is something that people don't realise. And what you do is you right-click on certificate templates and you go New Certificate Template to Issue, and then you get the full list of templates. But you can extend that list by creating your own templates. So, in terms of requesting certificates, people can do it manually. To do it manually, you use the certificates console. Some certificates will require approval. Now, a person will only, or a computer will only be able to see certificates that have their certificate template properties set to enrol or auto-enrol. If they're not there, they won't see it in the list of certificates that they can enrol in. The drawback is that it's a really complicated process. So I was talking about the accountant before. He would probably have a problem with that. You configure an enrolment policy to determine how enrolment occurs. Generally, you're going to go with the Active Directory default enrolment policy, unless you've got reasons to go beyond that. In terms of manually requesting certificates, what you do is you open the MMC, you put the certificates thing in, you certificate snapping in, you right-click, you go request new certificate. It will then come up with this option. Which certificates do you want to request based on the permissions that you have? If you've got enroll for those permissions, you can request a certificate. You might need to go and provide extra information. This is often in the case of when you're requesting a web server certificate or a TLS certificate. For example, here, webserver.pluralsight.internal, and that will give as a common name, and that would literally be, if this was webserver.pluralsight.internal, and you were going to that DNS name, it would come up with all of the foo-foo in your favourite browser. You configure request handling on the CA, and that will be either set the certificate request automatically, depending, which means that someone needs to go and follow through with that, or you can set it to automatic, which means under some circumstances the certificate will be automatically issued without someone having to intervene. So with low priority certificates, you do it automatic. With high status, high concern, high security certificates, you require someone to manually go, yeah, that's okay. So here on the certificate template, you have the option of enabling CA Certificate Manager approval. And all that means is that any certificate issued from that certificate template must be manually approved before it will be issued. Now, auto-enrolment is the cool thing where you allow the automatic deployment of certificates. It requires that you configure group policy. It also requires the auto-enrolment permission on the template. So you have to go through, you need to edit the template, you turn on auto-enrolment for specific groups. Then you go through and you configure group policy and you say group policy now configures that. And then basically, if a person's security group is within the appropriate scope and their request or the policies within the appropriate scope, they will be automatically issued the certificate. This was very good for if you're implementing IPsec on your internal network and you want to get the certificates out fairly quickly. The benefit of auto-enrollment is that it simplifies the process of large-scale certificate deployment. Avoid using it with certificate templates that require approval if there is a large number of certificates to be issued. So you could have it so that you've got auto-enrollment, and then if you've turned on, well, you've got to go and manually approve all of those. So you do it with certificates that you would want to, like an IPsec certificate, where you can go back and revoke it later, should you so choose. So you configure auto-enroll. So you see here that I've got authenticated users and I've got the auto-enroll permission assigned on the certificate template. In terms of group policy configuration, you configure the certificate services client auto-enrollment policy, which allows certificates to be automatically enrolled and automatically renewed. Because if you turn on auto-enrollment, you don't want it to happen once, right? You want it to happen so that there's a cycle and there's a life cycle for those certificates where they're going to be renewed. So here's the policy. So enrollment policy configuration, enroll user and computer certificates automatically. You set that to enabled, and then renew expired certificates, update pending certificates, and remove revoked certificates. And then you can specify how you want to deal with expiry notifications. How long before someone's expired, or how long before something's automatically going to expire do you want auto-enrollment to occur? Now, an online certificate status protocol array. Now, if you remember, we talked about you go and check the full CRL. So what an OCSP array is, it's basically a web app that a request comes in and it just says, I've got this serial number of this certificate. Is this been revoked or not? So instead of pulling down the whole CD CRL and then the Delta CRL, what happens is each time the client just goes and goes, okay, is this here or not? And the web app, so it only has to submit a small amount of traffic and it gets a yes or no response. So it's far more efficient. So you basically, what happens is your CRL is published out to the OCSP, and the OCSP handles all of that process without people having to pull down the entire certificate revocation list each time. Okay, so we've talked about that. Your requirements are that you have an existing Active Directory Certificate Services deployment. You configure Active Directory Certificate Services to deploy the OCSP response signing certificates. So there's a whole lot of setup that you need to do where you need to get a special template and issue a certificate from a special template that will authenticate this special type of request to that, what is functionally a web app. Okay, so that's just going through the wizard of doing that, which you will see when you download the slides. So you need to, of course, update your AIA extension, and here where you will put, okay, we've got SID OCSP/OCSP, that's the web server address of the Online Certificate Status Protocol Array. And of course, only newly issued certificates from that certificate service are going to go and use that. So of course, for your older certificates, they're still going to need access to your original CDPs. Okay, in terms of security, someone who gains access to a CA can issue and revoke certificates. CAs that are trusted by third parties are far more likely to be attacked. So your internal CA that's only used by you, well, people might be interested in that, but they're probably a lot more interested in owning your domain controller. Several .gov CAs from around the world have been compromised, and the certs have been used to sign malware. Now, generally, security researchers figured this out pretty quickly because they're literally saying, wait a sec, we know that VeriSign goes and signs software from this particular company. Why is it being signed by this CA out of Egypt? CA out of Egypt might have been compromised. Or why is, the one from Wellington signing all of the, certificates for Microsoft Sydney? Probably not legit. General security tips. Restrict who can sign onto the CA. This is not rocket science, okay? You probably don't need to sign onto the CA. In fact, I believe certificate services is one of those things that's supported on server core, so you make the CA a server core machine and then you remotely manage it. RSAT tools allow remote management of the CA, and then use separate CAs to issue general use certificates that are used by everybody in the organisation, and then have a separate CA to issue high sensitivity certificates. So you saw that list of certificate templates. You can delete certificates that CA will issue. It won't delete them from Active Directory. It just means that CA can't issue them. So you've got your general use CA, and then you might have your high level CA that you do keep shut down most of the time, and you only bring up when you need to. So you can have an offline subordinate CA as well, as long as you move the CRL and the server certificate off that server. Limit which users can issue and revoke certificates. That's not rocket science, because most users wouldn't know how to do most of that anyway. And does everybody in domain admins need to be able to issue and revoke certificates? The answer is no. You should have specific certificate administrators. These people need to know what it does, and they need to be responsible for it. It doesn't mean that anybody who's got domain admin access can go in and manage the CA. So go and change the CA properties appropriately. You'd go and do that through here, where you configure the security. You can create, say, a security group called ADCS Managers, and then you say, well, I'm giving you the read, issue, and manage certificates permission. I'm not going to give you permission to manage the CA, but I'll give you permission to request the certificates. And then you can also then specify, whoops, did I? Oh, great. You can, oh, well, let's just finish there, because we're, oh, actually, I can fix that here. You can configure who goes and does that. Now, the final topic I wanted to talk about was make sure that you back up your CA on a regular basis. If you do a system state backup, you're backing up all of ADCS, but you can, from the console, simply back up the ADCS database, and that's the main thing that you need. In terms of restoring the CA, what you need to do is you'll need to, oh, forget that, that's obviously not going to work. You can restore the CA certificate database and the log. I'll just go down here. You can restore the certificate database and the database log. You restore the registry. Generally, what you will need to do when you restore a certificate server, depending on how broken it is, you might need to go and use a server with the same name, and then make sure that you recover to the server with the same name, or you just might need to recover the database in that way. Anyway, that's almost my entire hour, so I got through a lot there. We talked about certificates, certificate authorities, CRL CDPs, offline route CA, certificate templates, auto-enrollment, OCSP, CA security. I didn't talk about key archiving and recovery. That is simply where you get someone with the ability to extract the private key from the certificate services database. Be very careful about that. But that allows someone to recover a certificate or recover information in the event that someone else gets hit by a bus. If you've got any questions, please come down to the front after the session. Otherwise, please fill out your evaluations, and thank you very much for your attention.